History of the Cuban Crisis. (1962). The origins of the crisis. What has come to be called the Cuban Crisis of October 1962 had its roots in a decision by the leaders of the Soviet Union that the island in the Caribbean offered a hospitable location for offensive missiles and other weapons capable of transporting nuclear warheads swiftly to targets in the United States and Central America. It can be assumed that the decision to pursue this course of action, unprecedented in the nation that looks to Lenin for policy guidance, was taken early in 1962. On January 10th of that year, the Soviet news agency TASS announced that the Soviet Union and Cuba had signed a trade protocol of 1962, providing for a considerable increase in trade between the two countries. On the same day, the former president of the Cuban Communist Party, Juan Maranello, was named rector of the University of Havana. At his inauguration, Maranello declared that all students at the university would be requested to study Marxist-Leninist principles. The Castro government also made public plans to launch a nationwide network of revolutionary instruction schools for instruction in Marxism-Leninism. Another indication took a somewhat different form. On March 26, 1962, Castro denounced Aníbal Escalante, a longtime Cuban communist leader who symbolized the old-line hardcore group within the party that for years had maintained close ties with Moscow. The significance of this action by Castro was to show Khrushchev and his associates that there remained little chance that the traditional communists in Cuba would come to power. Ideologically, Castro had already placed himself in the Marxist-Leninist camp. While the Soviet leaders may have retained doubts about his reliability, the attack on Escalante plainly convinced them that there was no longer any reason to postpone a major investment in the Castro regime. It is not known whether the initiative for the emplacement of offensive missiles and bombers in Cuba came from Castro or the Kremlin. It may have started as a request by Castro for ground-to-air anti-aircraft missiles of the type which the Soviets claimed brought down a high-flying U-2 photo-reconnaissance plane over Russian territory in the spring of 1960. It now appears more probable that these weapons were supplied to Cuba by the Soviets, primarily to provide anti-aircraft protection for the medium-range and intermediate-range missiles. In one sense, it is difficult to see what Castro would gain from the presence of offensive weapons on Cuban soil. All the IRBM and MRBM sites, both those constructed and those contemplated, were of the hardened type, unsuitable only for first-strike use. They thus would make Cuba a prime target for preemptive United States military attack in any crisis anywhere in which use of the missiles seemed likely. By offering its territory to Soviet IRBMs and MRBMs capable of delivering nuclear warheads to targets in the United States, the Castro regime placed its own country and people in nuclear jeopardy. Establishing a Soviet offensive striking force in Cuba was a logistic exercise of great scope, conducted under conditions of drum-tight security. The missiles, bombers, and related systems had to be brought to secure ports in the Soviet Union for loading onto ocean-going ships. Personnel to operate the missiles and to perform the many other functions connected with an effort of this size and character on a Spanish-speaking island thousands of miles away had to be assembled and trained. Security measures within the Soviet Union appear to have been completely effective. The arms were under tight Soviet military supervision, first in the Soviet Union itself and aboard Soviet ships, then in Cuba, where the offensive missiles and other weapon systems were unloaded by Soviet personnel in secure ports, some of them especially constructed for this purpose, and transported in Soviet manned truck convoys to sites from which Cubans were excluded, then deployed and erected by Soviet crews. In addition, the Soviets sought to divert attention from missiles by frequently assuring us over a period of some months that there would be no offensive weapons in Cuba. Once the missiles arrived in Cuba and had to be transported in trucks and other conveyances to their destined launch sites, fragmentary reports on them began to reach U.S. intelligence agencies. From that moment on, knowledge in the U.S. government about what might be happening in Cuba began to become abreast of events. The missile installations were located and described in considerable detail before the missiles were actually capable of being fired. It is thought by some that no nuclear explosives were ever landed in Cuba. A ship suspected of transporting such warheads was en route to Cuba at the time of the proclamation of interdiction. It was one of those which turned around and returned to the Soviet Union. To be sure, nuclear warheads could be carried by air, but there is no indication as such that any were actually brought to Cuba. The missiles did not make sense without nuclear tips, and the U.S. government had to assume the warheads were there, yet the possibility remains that none actually ever survived.